Adam A. Adams is with us now. How are you doing today?
I'm doing really well. How are you, Toby?
I'm doing great today, I think. Have you had a good Christmas and New Year?
Christmas and New Year's was awesome. Just kind of hanging out with the family, and
Yeah.
making it a little bit easier on work and trying to relax. And I think that it was well deserved after a long 2020.
Yep.
But yeah, thanks for asking.
Yeah. Now, you kind of help people set up their own podcasts, don't you?
Yes, so we do three things.
Mm.
We either help people launch a podcast, and we don't do it the normal way. Like
Mm.
we either launch a top 10% podcast or a top 1% podcast. The top 1% podcast is a little more
Mm.
costly, but we do all the marketing and everything. And what that entails is because we do marketing, and nobody else really does that.
Yeah.
So for a launch, it's either, hey, look, you can have a crappy podcast, go ahead and start it. That's
Yeah.
fine. But if you want to work with us, you can either have a top 10% podcast for a low price or a top 1% podcast for a higher price. And we'll do everything. We'll pay for the marketing. We'll support you in everything. So that's one thing we do. We
Yeah.
launch podcasts, or we do post-production. So people that have shows will do like all the editing, the mixing. Will be their back office for communicating with a guest afterwards, so that the guest shares the show, and we create all the marketing material for them.
Yeah.
So yeah, so that's the second thing, is post-production. And the third thing is for people that already have shows where we're not really starting it, but they still want that marketing expertise. All we do is just help them market the show, like help them grow their audience.
Yeah.
Like I know you have a huge audience.
Yeah, absolutely. Because we have a lot of listeners on the radio, and then the interviews go out themselves as a podcast. So I think it's quite important to explain to some listeners who are listening to this on the radio and might not necessarily know what a podcast actually is. Maybe they're part of the older generation, because it's kind of a new thing, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I think podcasting was like a 2006, 2007-ish, around there is when it was really coming up, but there wasn't
Yeah.
very many podcasters. There's over 60 million YouTube channels right now. If
Wow.
you knew that, 60 million YouTube channels. And currently there's only 1.5 million podcasts.
Hmm.
And almost half of it happened in just 2019,
Wow.
because or 2020, excuse me, during
Yeah.
like the pandemic.
Yeah.
So what is a podcast? It's like the radio. Like you
Yeah.
mentioned, you're recording it live now. It's going live on the radio now. And the interview also goes on to the podcast. So the podcast is really beneficial for people that want the value, but they can't tune in at that exact time.
Yeah.
Like I'm not available at 1 o'clock on a Wednesday
Yeah.
when he's doing it live. So I've got to do it. I want to listen to, the recordings on my own time. Like when I'm driving, like an Audible, they might do
Yeah.
podcasts instead. Or they might listen to like all of your episodes. And it really came out with the iPhones, and like the iPhone started doing all these podcasts, the Apple Podcasts. It was so easy. But now like Google has a podcast, Stitcher, iHeart, they're all over the place where people host these, but it's basically recorded content, just like we sit down in front of Netflix. Do you have Netflix in where you live?
Yes, we've got
Okay,
everything.
I figured.
Netflix, Disney Plus,
Netflix.
Amazon Prime.
So just like we sit down in front of Netflix and we might binge watch like an entire season, some people do that with your radio, your podcast.
Yeah. So you mentioned about the top 1% in podcasts. What does that mean? Is that in terms of the popularity or just the quality of it?
Really, really good question, because top 1% or top 10% can be measured in many different ways. So like you can get on the Chartable charts. Chartable has these like charts. Apple has these charts. iTunes has these charts. Podkite has charts. Libsyn and all these other places, they aggregate the data and they try to figure out which ones are good and bad. And there's one way to look at it is how many downloads you're getting.
Yeah.
Like you can measure just on the downloads, but some podcasts are getting ranked, top 20 in the United States or top 20 in this other country, in this one category, but they don't even have a whole bunch of listeners, right? So it's not always the downloads.
Yeah.
So what I've done in my company is like because I actually guarantee those results within 6 months of launching your podcast, you will be in the top 10% or you will be in the top 1%. I guarantee them. And so I have to figure out, how do we measure them? And it's for us, we measure them based on, we measure the top 1% based on if they have a certain amount of ratings and reviews. Like, this is people taking action and actually rating the podcast. So just to give you an idea, 0.6% of podcasts have 100 ratings or more.
Okay.
0.6, so less than 1%. So with us, when somebody does the top 1%, I'm actually getting them in the top 0.6%, which is better than 1.
Yeah.
Because my guarantee is you're going to have at least 100 ratings and reviews and 12,000 downloads in that first, in that first month and within that first 6 months. So those are the two metrics we do: 12,000 downloads, which is a lot, by the way, for new podcasts, and 100 ratings and reviews.
Yeah. So is it a bit risky to guarantee those results? Because usually in any kind of marketing or anything, there's always a disclaimer that says we can't guarantee listeners and sales and stuff. How do you ensure that you can?
It can be risky. So far, we have a flawless track record, which is just freaking awesome. I'm really excited about that. But so far, it's a flawless track record. And the guarantee is if you don't hit the top 10% within 6 months, I write you a check for $5,000.
Oh, wow.
5,000 US dollars. Or if you don't hit the top 1% on Apple Podcasts within 6 months on this other one, I write you a check for 10,000. I've never had to do that.
Yeah.
And part of it is how we do our marketing. So we do a few things. I teach the client how to get ratings and reviews. And then I have my marketing team. We have a bunch of assistants that do private messaging, and we do Facebook ads, and we do Google ads and all these other kinds of things. So we're blasting it out in front of a lot of people, and we actually do one-on-one outreach with individuals. And so usually we'll hit that sometimes within days or just a month. Wow. And my guarantee is 6 months. So I'm not concerned about it. I know that we are going to be able to achieve it in multiple different ways. So
yeah, absolutely. So why should somebody listening start up a podcast? Maybe they've never heard of it before and they weren't really interested. Is there any reason why they should? Yeah,
there's two main reasons. Three, if you count that it's kind of your business card these days.
Yeah.
So there's so many people starting they're writing books these days. There's so many people starting podcasts or YouTube channels or radio shows. It's growing. That is growing, and in a way, it's becoming like your business card. But really, there's two main reasons why somebody would want to start a podcast. Either A, they want to add value to other people, like they want to give back. They want to make their legacy on the world. They're just doing it for selfless reasons, to just put all that, what's in their brain or in their heart, out to other people, so that when they pass away, they left their legacy. They did their role. That's one reason why some people might want to have one. And the other reason is because it's really what grows our businesses the most. Having either writing a book or having a radio station or having a podcast or a YouTube channel or a blog where you're the thought leader is what's helping people to be able to grow these days. And they say that if you don't get with the program, if you don't start doing this now, your business is going to lose, because people are starting to only do business with the social media influencers, the radio hosts, the podcast hosts. The people who have that thought leadership are going to be stealing the business from the people that don't. So either you're going to do it because you want to just give back, or you're going to do it because you know your business will fail if you don't have that influence.
Yeah. They say that everyone has got at least one book in them. You hear that a lot.
Yeah.
Do you think it's maybe the same for podcasts? Has everyone got something that they can talk about?
Yeah. Like for me, I would love to start a podcast about mountain biking. I love mountain biking. It doesn't serve my business, but I could be part of it, and I could grow and learn and connect. Or I could do it about fasting. I do this thing called the OMAD diet, one meal a day. OMAD, O-M-A, 1 meal a day. And so it's fasting. I do intermittent fasting. I would be thrilled to have a podcast about that.
Yeah.
I love my kids. I love my family. Maybe I would start a podcast about family. But I actually have two podcasts. One is I do real estate investing and I raise private money. So I have a podcast about that, which actually helps me raise millions of dollars of OPM, other people's money, to be able to close on more deals without having to do mine. So that's a reason why I started that podcast. And I actually have a podcast on podcasting. It's the podcast on podcasting. And it's because my business serves podcasters. And I want to be able to add more value to people that are becoming podcasters. And in turn, it's going to help me to be able to have that following of people that say, if you are starting a podcast or if you want to grow a podcast, you got to go with Adam Adams.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Everyone has to have a podcast. It doesn't matter what it's about. We have at least one book in us, and we have at least probably 5 podcasts in us.
Definitely. It's a very exciting thing. And if 500,000 new podcasts started in 2020, the same will probably happen again this year, depending on how things go.
Yeah. You never know. And we're only a couple of percentages of the amount of YouTube channels. If you do it, it's like 2.5%. There's only 2.5% of podcasts as there are YouTube channels. So there's like 40 something times the amount of YouTube channels as there are podcasts. So the podcast is actually going to be growing. And what's interesting is people prefer to learn on podcasts because they don't have to use their eyes. They don't have to be stuck to a screen. They can cook, they can clean, they can go jogging, or they can be driving and they can be learning on a podcast. And you can't do that with video. And so that's where the higher net worth people are moving toward listening to podcasts versus watching YouTube. So if you want to start a podcast, now is really the time.
Yes, and we're going to talk a little bit about how to start a podcast when you come on with us for our next interview in a little while. But in the meantime, where are people able to organise a call with you to talk about starting a podcast?
Yeah, probably the best. I have a Calendly link. It's just calendly.com/Adam Adams, and it's a private link. So they actually have to also put in /my podcast. If they want to start a podcast and have a one-on-one call with me, they go to this link, and hopefully you can put it in the show notes, because not everybody's going to know what Calendly is, but I'd like them to be able to just click on it. So calendly.com/Adam Adams /my podcast.
Great. Well, thank you very much for joining us today, and we'll have you on again next week to talk about how to go about it.
Looking forward to it. Thanks, Toby.